My topic today is the dealing with the past in the digital space of the present, and the question of whether and how certain aspects of the past are continued in the digital space, or whether they are transformed under the conditions of digitality. My professional perspective as an employee of a state or regional library with responsibility for the cultural heritage of a German federal state, and thus as an operator of one of these portals I'm dealing with today. And due to my own academic background, so my perspective is that one of regional history and of the area studies. Therefore, I would like to work with the concept of transregionality, as it has been used in recent years to examine some phenomena in the Saxon, Czech, Polish border region, especially with regard to the nature and changes of regional identities in this area. An example for that is the so-called regional portals, or Regionalportale, as it's called in German. Portal sites or doorway pages dedicated to the history and cultural heritage of a specific region, which is often identical to a current German federal state. And I think these portals therefore run the risk of perpetuating not a national only, but a regional only narrative, and not opening up into or even transcultural perspectives. So the structure of my short presentation is the follows. I would just like to briefly introduce what these regional portals actually are. Second, I would like to explain what can be understood by the term transregionality. And third, I would like to formulate some initial answers to the questions raised so far in the form of thesis or assumptions, what you like. And these assumptions are not based on a research project, but from observations from day-to-day work in this area. So as a short preliminary remark, we are dealing here with what I have rather freely called a paradox of place in the title. That on the internet, which has been conceived as inherently intercultural from its beginnings, as stated in the call for papers for this conference, locality is sometimes emphasized again. And the internet is often organized according to national or linguistic borders, which has many understandable reasons, but where, in my opinion, borders are sometimes maintained where they not need to be. So for the first point, what are these regional history web portals or Regionalportale? You can hear some examples here on the slide. The portals from Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, Thuringia, and Saxony. These portals with their specific regional access can be understood as a subset of cultural portals in general, subject or content-related internet portals operated by cultural or memory institutions that serve as a central entry point or compass for specific thematic research in content selected, organized, cataloged, and presented by these memory institutions. They all offer a number of comparable application scenarios, the search for information on important personalities or on cities, localities, subregions, the possibility of an overview of relevant source holdings on the history of these areas, and the digital presentation of a region's cultural heritage. On the one hand, these internet offerings are aimed at state history and regional studies research, and on the other hand, at a broad culturally and historically interested public, especially local historians, amateur historians, or other citizen scientists are among the most important user groups of these portals. And there are two main operators of these offerings. On the first hand, regional research institutes, such as the Hessian Institute for Regional History or the Institute for Saxon History and Cultural Anthropology. And then there are regional research infrastructure institutions in the field of libraries and archives, regional and state libraries, such as the Bavarian State Library in Munich, the Thuringian University and State Library in Jena, or the SLUB Oslo, where I work, and state archives such as the State Archive in Baden-Württemberg. Libraries in particular have developed into important actors in shaping the digital representation of the cultural heritage of the region for which they are responsible, often on a legal basis. They digitize and present historical sources such as books, maps, letters, manuscripts, They develop tools for cataloging these materials. They interpret and contextualize them, for example, through digital exhibitions or through thematic clusters within these regional portals. In contrast to the increasingly dynamic and participatory negotiation of the cultural heritage in the post-digital age, which Luisa Conti has recently pointed out in her paper on cultural identity and cultural heritage, with these regional portals, we see a traditional engagement with this topic of the cultural heritage by these state institutions. The first of these portals were founded in the early and mid-2000s, so some 25 years ago. Today, most, but not all of the German federalist states have such a central offering, in addition to portals at the level of sub-regions. Exchange about these portals takes place in the so-called AG Regionalportale, which provides also an overview of the corresponding offerings in the German-speaking area. And you can see here on the right-hand side that there are also such web portals in Switzerland, in Austria, in Belgium, or in Liechtenstein. So due to the regional frame of reference of these briefly presented portals, I'd like to come to my second point. I'd like to present the concept of transregionality a bit more precise, and distinguish it from a political science or human geographical concept of transnationality, as it is often used in the context of the European integration process. So this is a kind of a specific application of this concept, and well used in a different context in the research area of inter or transculturality studies, so comes more from this political sciences point of view. As Christoph Waag pointed out a good 10 years ago, transnationality as a common term for transcending, breaking through, and overcoming national spatial constellations within the European project at the beginning of the 21st century no longer seems sufficient due to the strengthening and increasing emphasis on the regional level, for example, in the European Union. It is therefore only consistent to use the term transregional spaces instead of transnational spaces in a scalable adjustment. And this phenomenon, transregionality, can thus be understood as a spatial construct whose characteristics can be understood as a spatial, as a social phenomenon in the differentiation and thus demarcation from something other. The term transregionality can be used to describe how cultural, economic, and social-political spaces develop beyond or above or below national boundaries. And therefore, for Waag, it is closely linked to the everyday component of the construction of such spaces. So, and this can have two meanings: that we go beyond the boundaries of a region, which presupposes that we first must have a clear idea about the region that is to be transcended. But it can also mean that these phenomena concern several regions. And both aspects are relevant for the analysis of these regional portals I talk about today, which brings me to my third point, where I would like to present some theses on the topic. The first one being political framework conditions make transregionality difficult or even counteract it. In Germany, the federal states are generally responsible for cultural matters, and thus also for the corresponding legislation, administration, and financing. That is what we call the Kulturhoheit der Länder, the cultural sovereignty of the federal states. There are certain exceptions in the scientific sector through national third-party funding or programs such as the Excellence Initiative or the Excellence Strategy for the German universities. But offerings such as these regional portals are consistently financed by state funds or at most supplemented by foundation funds. And a current example is the so-called Culture Cloud in Lower Saxony, which is largely financed by the Volkswagen Foundation. As a rule, such an approach to finance and to organize those Dutch portals is associated with goals of regional and not supra or trans-regional identity formation. This is usually already evident in the name of the regional portals, which often take up the state name. I have here the logos of 4 of these portals. On the upper left-hand side, Bavaricon for the state of Bavaria, Leo BW, where the BW stands for Baden-Württemberg, the Tura in Cultura for Thuringia, and well, obviously Saxon Digital for Saxony. So we always have the state names in here, in the names of these portals. And the state colors are also often used in the visual design. We have this little blue dot of the eye in the shape of a rhombus in Bavaricon. We have the black and the gold for Baden-Württemberg, and we have the Saxon green in the logo of Saxon Digital. An explicit formulation by a department head in the Saxon State Ministry for Science, Culture and Tourism in a contribution to an anthology in which he dealt with the goals and expectations of politics regarding regional history research reads the following. This person said there, regional history research should enable knowledge transfer, specifically convey knowledge about the past with the aim of being able to give the local population a sense of identification with their own state. And it is obvious that for such a goal, for supporting the formation of a regional identity, only certain historical topics are suitable and others would have to be excluded. Overall, it can be said that in the federal structures, the change of cultural and memory institutions with regards to digitalization is still too uncoordinated also in many ways. This sometimes leads to duplication of work, to insufficient exploitation of opportunities for cooperation, and division of labor between the federal government, the federal states, and the memory institutions. A second thesis, the resulting implicit concept of region in regional portals unintentionally perpetuates the essentialization of borders. From the previous thesis, it becomes clear that regional portals orient their content to the borders of the today's federal states. However, a discussion of the self-limitation usually does not take place, and I do not exclude myself as someone responsible for one of these portals in Saxony. In the self-descriptions of the portals, the reference to the current federal state is usually articulated in the imprint of or in the About Us section, and this is associated with 2 problems. Material relevant to the study of the history and cultural heritage of the respective state is, of course, also available in institutions outside the current territory, which is usually not clear from a search within these regional portals. And second, some of today's federal states have remained relatively stable territorially, while others have undergone significant changes. You can see here such a famous map of the Holy Roman Empire with the famous patchwork carpet, which depicts the proverbial Kleinstaaterei in Germany. And today's Saxony, is only a section of what historically lay in the sphere of influence of the former ruling house of the Wettins. This concerns territories that are today in Bavaria, in Brandenburg, in Saxony-Anhalt, in Thuringia, but also in Poland and the Czech Republic. And this fluidity of territorial borders is rarely addressed in these portals, and instead the implicit impression is given that the current boundaries of the states have always been this way. Although these portals deal with history, they often give the impression of regions that are kind of historyless, whereas precisely the explicit treatment of the changeable past would offer great opportunities in the sense of the transregional approach. So, and coming to a last thesis, in some cases, regional portals succeed in overcoming physical boundaries in the digital realm and through digital methods. I would like to present here an example from the work of SLUB, and we coordinate the so-called Saxon State digitization program for science and culture, the Landesdigitalisierungsprogramm. And there, a focus in recent years has been the digitization of holdings that have been stored in East Central or Eastern European libraries since 1945, especially the University Library Wrocław, the Jagiellonian Library in Krakow, and the Russian State Library in Moscow. So both Polish libraries hold collections from Saxon libraries that had been relocated to castles near the River Nise during World War II. And this concerns what is referred to as war-displaced cultural property. And we had some projects with these libraries since 2017, where we did not discuss the legal and ownership issues of the cultural property, and where now these digital copies are presented in both Saxon Digital and in the collections of the partner libraries. The transregional and above all transcultural significance of the project is particularly evident in the holdings of the Upper Lusatian Library of Sciences in Görlitz, many of whose unique materials, which are a part of the historical memory of Upper Lusatia as an East Central bridge region between Saxony and the historical Silesia and Bohemia, have been very difficult to access since 1945. The Görlitz example is also an interesting case insofar as the city between 1815 and 1945 did not belong to Saxony, but to Prussia, which adds another level of regionality to the web of relationships. So we can see that in some cases, these portals succeed in making existing borders more porous. In others, they tend to contribute to their continuation. And in the case of these region-specific offerings, the paradox of location or of place will, I think, not be resolved in the foreseeable future. Perhaps it cannot be resolved at all. So thank you very much for your attention. Here's a short bibliography, which I also put on our blog, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.